more world building, they need to provide more development in and be a contrast to the hero, for example. The question here is when they are shown as their background is, for example, the bad, why portray them as villains in the very first place? Insofar as they are victims, portraying them as the villain is something that is morally unjust because it's quite literally allowing them to be punished, to be, for example, criticized by the general people. And for example, as a whole, their entire storyline is simplified to be something that's negative. This is then our portrayal. Any POI before that? Three, two, one. Our
POI,
moral ground then. Sure.
do you not think that within society there exists people who have the capability of media literacy, the people who are capable of actually saying that, oh,
Okay,
maybe
I
this
get
person
your
isn't a
point.
music. Okay.
Sure. Let's allow that for that point to happen. That still has not contested with Ivanka. When we told you that discussion sure does happen, and people sometimes do justify it, but at the end of the day, they're still placed at what? As what? Villains. We directly oppose the direct titlement of them as villains in the very first place because they are victims of some sort of larger implication. Because when generally we see this a lot in society, that for example, when Trump places like ICE to go to rural areas in order to imprison people, what happens? He portrays them as villains that do become thieves, as immigrants that do steal jobs. This is the thing that we do see in society that has never been engaged at all by opposition side. That's because the narrative that is dominant is that there's more world building behind the hero than there is behind the villain in the very first place. Therefore, that oftentimes lack discussion. But secondly, even if we were to tell you, Ivanka still does happen to tell you that at the end of the day, they're still portrayed as negative. Notice, nobody wants to watch a 1 hour video. Two, there's still implicit bias behind these individuals. When society sees certain actions as morally unjustifiable, people, when there's just a lack of characterization, just generalize them as the entire villain as a whole. But notice, this is all in terms of social inequality. When we have more narratives that portray this person as a good person, even though, for example, they're not that good and all of their actions may have been unjustified, when you have more storytelling behind it, people see it as a good thing. What's a good example of this? If you know Kasbreker from Six of Crows, he has a gang of like criminals, for example, and they do things just for his solidarity, for example. This oftentimes portrayed him as a good person because of his large, more in-depth background. And anything that comes in opposition to this suddenly becomes seen as the villains, when in fact, maybe they are also a bad person. This is where the titlement of villains in itself is already negative and harmful, Judge. But then, why do you believe that? Why should you believe this? Because you believe on the first instance of portrayal as negative, there is no such thing as redemption. This is not a justified punishment. Our thought process of this is that you do not cut off the arm of a thief just because they stole a wallet. It's just in terms of the criminal justice system, not something that is proportionate to the punishment at the end of the day. But then, secondly, look at societal impact and discussion. They tell you that we are teaching people to not have empathy, that social understanding around the background suddenly become justifiable grounds to be violent. Firstly, we already tell you that it's exactly because we already have implicit bias around social norms existing. That's why people do not rarely do provide enough discussion to actually be against it. But secondly, this is also mainstream media. That is to say, this exists in majority. That is to say, when people generally see these people as bad, even if there's any discussion, backlash does happen that do silence these minorities in the very first place. But finally, this is something that's inexclusively happening under our side of the house. We tell you this is something that is of a double standard. When heroes suddenly do something morally questionable, rarely do people actually question it in the bad extent that they are suddenly framed as the villain, because somehow it's seen as something that's morally okay. But then they try to tell you about, oh, challenging the status quo, that it's okay. And somehow that villains are something that's morally vague, and somehow they're victims, and I don't know, people that are victims of status quo. They're trying to steal our case here. But why that not happen? Because we gave you stronger characterization of how people do actually look at the current status quo when they are portrayed as villains and lack any proper characterization. This in itself should be our main path to victory to prove to you why actually this is not something that's good in the very first place. But secondly, let's look at our comparative here. We believe that from the very beginning, portraying something as morally bad or directly showing to you that there is going to be like an evil that is inherently evil provides better character development. Why? Because under our side of the house, we allow for character development to happen to these heroes and be focused around these heroes instead. That means that people do care about this and have a better lens of how to look at society. If they try to look at discussions about how it's going to be like illiterate, we don't believe that is true. Why? Because quite literally, when you look at these villains, you're still going to suffer from implicit bias. Even if there was any point of justification, you are probably going to ignore them in reality because they are not the focal point of that story in itself. How do you weigh this then, Judge? We already give you strong enough characterization, enhancing our likelihood. But two, they never give you a strong enough comparative why the portrayal of these villains are going to be good and no actually proper likelihood as to why people are going to portray these villains as victims as society in the very first place. Three, we provide you strong enough social implications of how people are actually going to look at this in a general society, of how radical environmentalists do work. Why is that so? Because it's exactly this type of media that portrays these people differently. Meanwhile, media is something that is crucially important because it influences how we look at society as a whole. Under all of those reasons, if you believe in justice, if you believe in the victims, I beg you, Judge.
Thank you so much, Government Whip, for the speech. Next up, calling upon the Whip of Opposition to deliver their speech. You're here.
Check, check. Am I audible?
Yes, audible and visible.
Before I start, my preference of POI is to chat, so you can just write POI in chat. Then, if I allow you, then you may unmute. But if I don't allow you, it means, or if I continue with my speech, it means I do not allow you. But again, please, before you unmute your mic, write POI first. Then, if I allow you, do not cut me in my speech. Um, Other than that, I don't think there's any sensitive topic. If there is, it's only for the purpose of this debate. And yeah, hold up. Okay. So let me start my speech in three, two, one. But also, I don't think that at the end of the day, their arguments are even that exclusive because why? Their counterfactual is the fact that what they want to create they want to like say that oh on their side of the house they want to like explain more of the background of the villain itself so people can actually understand what the villain itself. They try to portray for the fact that the industry doesn't understand that people actually wants context about why someone actually wants to be a villain itself, why someone is fight at the end of the day a villain itself. What? Because you have to understand the one is actually born as a villain. People become a villain because of various reasons. For example, because of background, because of like their trauma and so on and so forth. Especially if the portrayal would repeat this thing, portrayal is what? Portraying characters with radical visions of justice itself. No one would get a radical vision of justice itself just as they're born itself. No, of course they would get a radical vision of justice because of their life experience itself, because of the background story that they actually had, and so on and so forth. So people are actually not born as a villain just because they're evil itself. No, especially again, if it's this complex itself, the portrayal is this complex itself. Of course, there's also always a background itself. And what we have to understand, digital literacy and media literacy actually exist in this world in this status quo right now. People actually understand. People also want to know about the background of the villain itself. And we also have to understand it's not exclusive on their side of the house. If they want to say, oh, on our side of the house, there's no background story at all about the villain itself. No, there's still background story about the villain itself. Because why? That's literally what's needed for the people itself. People actually need context to understand why there's suddenly a villain itself. And the industry also knows this
POI.
itself. The industry also later I said to chat. The industry also understands why people actually would need this context itself, why people actually want to understand this context itself. Because why? I suddenly question why at the fact on our side of the house they try to portray and try to characterize and frame for the fact that people on our side of the house don't want to understand the context of these villains itself, don't want to understand the background of these villains itself. But then suddenly on their side of the house, people suddenly want to watch 1 hour documentaries about the villains itself. They want to understand and find out more about the villains itself, which I think is a very uncharitable characterization, Judge. If both of the house, why can't we on our side of the house also have people actually also wants to have the background story of the villains itself, also wants to understand the background story of the villains itself? I think on both of the house, there's also these kinds of people actually understands and want to find out about these things itself. And if at the end of the day they say the media literacy, like the tendency of like the trend itself, the mainstream thing also like spreads on social media itself. People on social media would also spread about these things, these kinds of findings, if they're actually like movie geeks itself, right? So I think on both of the house, there's always going to be people that actually finds out about the true main story about the villain itself, if they're actually into that story itself, if they're actually into that movie itself. So none of their arguments at the end of the day is that exclusive. But before I continue, your POI.
Let me remind you what the story actually looks like in the very first place. Even in the case that, oh, these villains suddenly have more integration of what their background story in the very first place look like, let's wash out that clash. Inherently, villains are still titled villains.
Yes, villains are exactly titled villains, and this is why I want to explain. We have to understand why they're actually titled as villains itself. Let me question you. Is Akaza a villain because of their background story or because of his actions of killing Rengoku itself? Yes, most of you may answer because of what? Because he killed Rengoku and that's why people see him as a villain itself. The reason why someone is a villain is not because of their visions of radical justice that is wrong. No, our side of the house has never said to you that that the main problem is the radical vision of justice. No, from my first and second speaker itself, they have continuously explained for the fact that well, those who actually become villains itself is because of their actions itself. It's because they try to answer the fact, for example, Thanos was to scarcity and so on and so forth by erasing half of the population itself. The action is the one that's actually being the one that actually makes these people makes this person itself, the character itself, being framed as a villain itself, not because of the radical act or radical vision of justice itself. But why is this still a justified thing to be portraying them as a villain itself? Why? Because the action itself is one a very radical thing. If they're not portrayed as a villain itself, or probably as I don't even understand what the proposition itself that is trying to portray them as, either as a great character, but they have never explained what is even a great character itself, or they just want to like at the end of the day like rely on the audience itself, like oh yeah, the audience at the end of the day becomes more background story, then they can understand that no, they're not villains itself, which I have explained before why that can still happen on our side of the house, because background story still exists. You can still understand why Akaze actually becomes a demon itself and so on and so forth, why Suguru Geto actually wants to like kill all of the sorcerers and so on and so forth. So even though I feel we have to make this very clear, on both sides of the house, background story still exists, so you watch that out at the end of the day. But then let's go on to the clash about villains itself. Why is it still justified as a villain itself? We have to, and I've said before, they're still justified as a villain itself because of their actions itself. Their actions is one very radical for the fact that if you don't portray them as a villain, then people will feel that, oh, yeah, it's okay for me to do that itself. Because why? Because I already have a sad background story and so on and so forth. So like I see the movie itself because as we can understand, I think both sides of the house actually like understands and also like symmetrically agrees to this. Movie at the end of the day portrays social compass, like portrays like moral compass in the society itself, right? So if you're actually not portraying as a villain itself, it means the moral compass that you're trying to tell is like it's okay if you do something bad, it's okay if you do something radical, as long as the vision is radical enough, as long as the fact that yeah, I have a certain enough background story, and it's okay for me to do this because why? Even people in movies do this itself, and people actually justify the action itself. So me as a person itself, after I watch that movie, I will also do the same thing, and this is exactly what they're trying to remove. This is exactly what they're trying to protect at the end of the judges, because on their side of the house, people that these actions are actually wrongdoing itself. People never understand for the fact that yeah, whatever they do itself, whatever the actions itself, is very bad itself because why? It's very radical itself. And no one can actually like justify radical action itself. They have never explained judges on their side of the house. Why is it okay to actually justify radical actions itself? And this is exactly why they have failed to even protect the villains itself. Because why? The main reason, as our first, second, all of our speakers have basically said before, they're villains not because of their visions itself, but because of their actions itself. And this is exactly why we still have to portray them as villains itself, to give a clear moral compass of what is actually right and wrong. Because why? Something that is wrong can never be justified. That is what we have to understand. Because something that is wrong will always be wrong, and something that is right will always be right. You can never flip those two things, and this is something that the movie industry have always tried to like explain to you, and what is why villains becomes villains. But before I continue again, your POI.
But then suddenly, when heroes suddenly do something morally questionable, society sees it as something good because it's of their own objective. Secondly, is the fact that villains are pushed the entire burden that what they have done is entirely unjustifiable when sometimes it's just because their background and it's pushed based on necessity.
Yeah, but like at the end of the day, heroes are the main character of the story. What this actually means, I think this actually takes to like my first and second speaker actions about it's the villain's actions is basically like questioning the status quo, challenging the status quo itself. Because why? If the heroes doing this wrong and suddenly the villains challenges it, this is exactly why villains actually exist. We have to understand villains, why do they actually exist? Why do they actually like being portrayed at the end of the day? Because why? Because for example, they have to challenge the status quo itself. Did hero do something wrong and so on and so forth? That's why the hero villain comes. For example, yeah, you don't have to do this and so on and so forth. But again, we have to understand they're still portrayed as villains because why? I think I have continuous tons of time which you do not understand at the end of the day. They're still protected as villains because of their actions itself, never because of their vision itself. If you go to social media itself, you go to like for example any media literacy that you read about like films, movies, and so on and so forth, why are they actually villains? Because of their wrongdoings, not because of their visions itself. Especially when their vision is actually correct. And this is what you have to understand. I think most of the house, at the end of the day, do agree that these villains with like radical visions of justice itself, are still morally correct because of their visions itself. But what your side of the house does not agree for the fact is that they are villains because of their wrong actions, right? So what this actually means on your side of the house, you're basically justifying these wrong actions itself, creating a moral compass that in the society it's okay for you to do something wrong, which is definitely not true because why? Something wrong, as I said before, is always wrong. So they oppose.
All right. Thank you so much for the speech. Next up, I'm calling upon the reply speaker of the opposition team. Here.
Kak, audible?
Yes,
Is it
audible
clear?
and visible.
Okay. Since there will be no POI, I hope I don't say anything sensitive in my speech, but if I do, very sorry. I will start my speech. Maaf. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Notice that there has not been a clear stance coming under their side of the house in the very first place. Their first speaker said that they want to portray these evil characters as moral good. Their second speaker says that only pure evil should be deemed as evil. The third one says that they want to understand villains because they're true victims. But therefore, comparatively, under our side, there are two things in this debate that we have made way too clear. First off, what is a villain and why they cannot be justified? And second, how are we going to manifest that under this motion? Okay, first off, what is a villain in itself? Villain itself we already posed to you that it is someone who challenges the status quo, right? They come to the story as the opposition party. Therefore, but then let's notice that even in status quo, even in real life, there's not a single person who's like has pure evil intention. Nobody is born with that. But what differentiates you from being a villain better than you being a good person? Because when you manifest an action that eventually harms other people out there, when you try to force your way of fixing the world onto other people, but in the end you hurt more people out there, that's what a villainous act is. A villain is someone who takes away from someone else. So you create more harm than good in the end, and therefore your action cannot be justified at all because you actually hurt people in the process, no matter how good good your intention is. Because there's no main reason as there's no guarantee as well that you will gain that benefit from the villain itself. But then secondly, what do we mean exactly by the mainstream tendency in this motion? Mainstream tendency itself that means we do not oppose the idea of these narrative of them as a villain becoming a trend, and we believe that it is perfectly okay with labeling them as a villain because eventually label acts as a moral limitation, right? No matter how good your intention is, if you do something wrong and it is punishable, you are still a villain. You still have to own up to that consequences. That is what we want. But then let's do the biggest comparison on your side of the house. Let's compare the overall cases. Let's talk about which side eventually creates a better narrative in the society overall. But then let's talk about which side eventually helps people understand complex feelings and complex context better. Okay, first off, their framing of their side of the house increasingly centers around the idea that radical actors are fundamentally heroes and this institution primary villains in itself. Okay, they think that extremism becomes morally understandable to the point that it's justified, but over time it creates a social narrative where moral legitimacy will depend primarily on how justified your anger is, rather than if your method to actually solve it is ethical or not. And that's dangerous because it weakens the caution around the violence, or like revenge-based justice. If there will risk normalizing the belief that if the system is oppressive enough, ethics and morals becomes optional, which is totally not true because your actions will have consequences, will affect people. Under us of the house, we want to create a much more balanced social narrative. Like for example, we want to explain that system can absolutely still be flawed and justice can still radicalize people. Like that's okay. We're not opposing the idea of telling the stories of these people. We will still tell these stories, but we simply put them the label as, oh, they are a villain despite of whatever they did. So therefore, we want to tell them that extremism still have consequences, violence still requires scrutiny, and that we want to create a healthier message that understanding pain does not require glorifying harmful method. This is socially important important eventually because their side of the house because our side of the house preserves ethical boundaries. But then secondly, which side eventually help people better complex feeling context? I think eventually we win this comparison because their side of the house assumes feeling framing will prevent wants at the very first time. But I think modern mainstream media only prove the opposite, right? A lot of stories already tell about feelings who are emotionally complex, who are told about their trauma, their systemic injustice, but we still recognize that their authoritarian tendency and their destructive methods, that balance is what actually creates the deepest complexity. Their side of the actually oversimplifies this because they said the system caught this, therefore the radical actors justify. No, that's not true. The story becomes less about difficult moral choices under yourself, but more about validating the perspective itself. That makes their narrative under yourself eventually less rich. Eventually, our side of the house creates a better complexity because we keep a lot of truth. The system can still be unjust. The villain can be sympathetic. The villain's method may still be wrong. The hero can also be flawed. But the audience will empathize without fully endorsing actions. Therefore, the moral underside of the house is much more kept, therefore proud.
Thank you so much for ending the whole case from the opposition team. Next up, to wrap up the whole debate, I'm calling upon the vice speaker of the proposition team. Here.
Okay, hello everyone. Before I begin, I sincerely apologize in advance if some examples or like discussion in debate may be sensitive because like the motion involves those type of themes. I'm going to start my reply speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate was never about whether violence is wrong, right? Everyone in this room already agrees that murder, extremism, and harmful actions should be condemned. The real debate is whether mainstream media should continuously teach audience to emotionally fear radical anger more than the system that created that anger in the first place. Big mistakes needed to be pointed out. One, remember our main benefit, which is more acceptance toward radicalism. From the very start, we have explained to you how this is so urgent in this current status quo, but they never tell you how their side can achieve this same benefit. Op also refused to talk about this, and it also lost within this debate. Two, notice how all of their harms are also a slippery slope, only kept on bringing how our side justifies extreme violence and like, but it's not the actual point, right? Also, this harm only works with a simplistic characterization of society, which is extremely unrealistic. Also, no continuation of this argument on their second, third, and no progression at all. Reasons why we should win then. Firstly, on the issue of understanding radicalization versus moral simplification. We've proven to you, Judge, feeling narrative shapes how human emotionally process political anger. When radical characters are repeatedly framed through chaos, fear, instability, and destruction, audience subconsciously associate that radical dissatisfaction itself with danger. Therefore, people stop critically engaging with the structural suffering this character represents itself. We gave you clear example with like Thanos. Audience focus entirely on crazy feeling instead of meaningfully engaging with fears about collapse and unsustainable systems. With Joker, audience emotionally move from emphasizing with the abandonment and inequality to simply viewing him as evil once his anger becomes disruptive. Society naturally prefer acceptable victims, people who suffer quietly and politely. Once pain becomes angry or radical, empathy disappear. Most importantly, we've proven to you why this matters. Society that emotionally dismiss radical grief become worse at recognizing system suffering early. Instead of asking why people becoming this desperate, society uh, draw itself by believing these are simply bad people. What did we get as a response? I'll keep repeating three responses, but yeah, the weighing is quite simple. A, we never said harmful actions should not be condemned. Understanding why someone becomes radicalized is not the same as supporting what they do. Humans already separate these things naturally all the time. People understand like trauma without supporting. Wait. Secondly, even if opposition is correct that okay, villain label discourage harmful behavior slightly, they never answer the trade-off that audience also become emotionally attached to preserving stability over questioning injustice. Thirdly, accountability still exists fully under our world. The difference is we also preserve social understanding. Op sides only reacts after violence happens. Second issue, on the issue of disproportionate punishment. We've proven to you that on the very first instance, this oftentimes does mean that they do not have any moral depth. It's exactly because you do portray them in this manner. Why it what did we get in response then? The moment that they are actually heroes, suddenly what they did injustifiable. And it's okay. Therefore, we've proven to you is already crystal clear and our characterization is already existent. They tell you that villains challenge it, meaning that heroes doing something wrong that it's okay, but meaning they yet they are still our villains, but they still are okay and there's no check and balance. They cannot have it's directly unjustified here. That's all from me. I'm so proud standing in prop.
All right, thank you so much. That marks the end of the whole debate. Thank you so much, everyone. And also, maybe for the panels, maybe we can deliberate in. Oh, we don't really have the breakout room in this room, so maybe I think for the OC, can you please open a breakout room for us to deliberate? And yeah, I will be giving it back to Kak Joka as the CAP. There you go. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, thank you, Gwen. So sorry for the breakout room issue. I'm opening it now. Okay. Okay. Is the breakout room accessible for everyone?
It's still not okay. It appears now. Thank you so much, Kak Joka, and also for Anzia and Kak El. We can go to the delete room. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Juga from the CAP. For all the grind finalists, congratulations for making it this far, and yeah, congrats also for finishing on the debate. So what will happen now is that I will just give some quick information and then I will pass it to the MC. So, regarding the announcement for this competition, the way what will happen is that the judges will do their deliberations and then they will let the committee know. And then tonight, once the committee have finalized everything, the committee will announce the winner of the grand final and basically yeah the champion, first runner up, and also second runner up based on the semifinal points on the competition's Instagram. So at Cced Udayana, they will announce the winners of juara satu sampai juara tiga on their Instagram, and also the top 10 best speakers for this competition will also be announced on Instagram tonight once the committee is finished with everything. After the committee have made their Instagram announcement, the full tabulation will be released tonight following the Instagram announcement. But yeah, the Instagram announcement will be done first. Second, therefore, since Ccede has other branches of the competitions, the awarding of the winners will not take place today or tonight. So the awarding of the winners that is announced on Instagram will happen, I think, sometime next week. I forgot the date, but the organizing committee will let everyone know as well. So the official awarding for the champion, first runner up, and second runner up, and also the official awarding for all of the top 10 best speakers will happen next week. Date is to be clarified. Okay, so I guess that's all from me. But yeah, the actual announcement will be done through Instagram tonight for the winners, for the team winners, and then the top 10 best speakers following the tabulation release later in the night. Okay, thank you so much everyone for joining Chichi Ede Pre NSDC. I'm also accompanied by Zeus, who's a amazing fellow CAP. I think Zeus would also like to say, oh, okay. Uh, that I'm speaking on behalf for the both of us, and therefore, thank you so much for all the participants. I'm now passing the floor for the MC.
Baik, demikianlah sesi Grand Final Debate Competition and Charity of English Department 2026 yang dipimpin oleh Dewan Juri, dan acara selanjutnya yaitu penyerahan sertifikat kepada Dewan Juri yang diikuti dengan sesi foto bersama. Sertifikat akan diserahkan secara simbolis oleh Ketua Himpunan Program Studi Sastra Inggris dan Ketua Panitia Competition and Charity of English Department 2026 kepada Dewan Juri. Yang pertama, kepada Bapak Joshua Amadeo Enzo Rivaldo, persilakan dan himpunan dan persilakan untuk menyalakan kamera. Baik, untuk sesi dokumentasi, kami mohon untuk bersiap. Sesi foto akan saya pandu dalam hitungan 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi, 1, 2, 3. Selanjutnya, kepada Bapak Andreas Lorenzius, kami persilakan untuk menyalakan kamera. Baik, untuk sesi dokumentasi, kami mohon untuk bersiap. Sesi foto akan saya pandu dalam hitungan 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi, 1, 2, 3. Baik, demikianlah sesi dokumentasi. Kami menginformasikan bahwa hasil penilaian dan pengumuman pemenang akan diunggah pada akun Instagram Dayana dan dapat mengenai pengambilan hadiah. Akan kami informasikan lebih lanjut melalui narah hubung terkait. Dan demikianlah seluruh rangkaian acara Debate Day 2 Competition and Charity of English Department 2026. Kami mengucapkan terima kasih kepada semua pihak yang telah membantu dan menyukseskan acara ini. Terima kasih kami ucapkan kepada infobali-terkini.id, Tik Printing, Rasa Beauty, Fly Bali, Duna Seseh, info.event_, ajang.lomba, berita_lomba, eventdunder.id, ikut event, lomba SMA, pusat info lomba, story event Bali, info lomba, Udayana Fokus, Presiden University, Muhammadiyah English Debating Society, Hima Sastra Inggris Universitas Pamulang, dan Hima Sastra Indonesia Universitas Udayana. Tidak lupa, kami memohon maaf apabila terdapat kekurangan dan kesalahan selama acara berlangsung. Dengan ini, kami tutup dengan Parama Santi. Om Santi Santi Om. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Om, nama budaya, dan salam sejahtera untuk kita semua. Terima kasih. Peserta dan Dewan Juri dipersilakan untuk meninggalkan ruang virtual. Terima kasih.
Time to shine and I'm down around. I'm gonna drive onto